This week on The Futurists, Jerome Glenn.
Eventually, as an estimate, 10 years, the possibility of an individual acting alone, which is the key word here, acting alone, can make and deploy through synthetic biology, starting from scratch, such a weapon. And I don't want to go into details about how you deploy it and all that sort of stuff, but it's a possibility. And nobody really wants to talk too much about it in public because you want to figure out how to prevent this stuff before it ever starts.
Hey there. Welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tersick, your host. This week, my business partner, Brett King, is traveling once again. He never seems to stop. He sends his regards, but he can't join us for this interview, which is a bummer because we have a great guest on the show. A big welcome to Jerome Glenn. Jerome, welcome to The Futurist. We're thrilled to have you.
Nice to be here.
Now, Jerome, for the folks who are listening, Jerome is the CEO of the Millennium Project. And this is a project I've been tracking for some time, for a number of years. It came to my attention before the pandemic. And I'm thrilled to tell you that there's a new whopping, 500-page report that you just released about the future. 500 pages. So, folks, if you really want to go deep into the future, this is a good starting point for you. Jerome, tell us a little bit about the Millennium Project. How did it get started and what is it that it's focused on?
Well, it got started because the year 2000 was coming up when we were back in 88 talking about it. And we thought, we really should get our act together because the year 2000 will happen and guys like you will cram a microphone down our throat. And if we had too much to drink the night before, we'd say something stupid. So we figured we should create some mega system, whatever, for the year 2000. And so that evolved into a global participatory think tank, which it is now. We have what we call nodes, groups of individuals and institutions in 70 countries around the world, including Iran and in Israel, Pakistan and India. So we're not dealing with a country or an ideology or a particular issue. It's the idea of creating a global system to look at the global system, so to speak, and to see how we're progressing or regressing as a species into the future.
It's really important because your perspective of the future changes based on where you're standing. Your standpoint literally in a country, but also philosophically or professionally is going to define how you see the future. And, certain professions are closer to certain aspects of the future, so they loom much larger. And other aspects are less important, and so they seem distant and perhaps less relevant. So it's smart to have 70 different nations. And within each of those nations, what you call a node is actually a group of people, right? A group of professionals from different perspectives.
It's a mix, if possible. Nothing's perfect, right? But ideally, we get a couple from government who are future-oriented, a couple from business, a couple from NGOs, a couple from universities, and maybe a couple from whatever international systems in the country. So that in a sense, when we ask a question like the future of eyeglasses or whatever, the business guys know who to ask in business. The government people know who to ask. So it's a global brain-picking system, essentially.
Really smart. And then do you delegate responsibility down to the nodes? So are they responsible for organizing and they figure out who to add to the panels and who to talk to?
Yeah, they're in total control of who they recommend.
And is this a paid gig or is it volunteers? Is it more like an academic project?
It's a mix. When we're funded, it's a paid gig. Sometimes we do stuff because we think it's too important to wait around, and we just go ahead. And then we get some side money, and we'll give honorariums to people for doing different things. So it's a mixed bag. It's mostly voluntary, but there's also some cash through the system too.
That's very cool. And as I recall, I may have gotten this wrong, but my understanding is that some of the inspiration for this project stems from the Rand Corporation. In other words, you folks were working on this as early as the 1970s.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Ted, my co-founder, Ted Gordon, just passed away recently. He was at the Rand Corporation in the early days. And he later created what was called the Futures Group. And it was the Futures Group that approached me because I could spell the word future and it was working with the UN. They said, can this be a UN thing?
Yeah.
So it sort of evolved. So it wasn't directly Rand, but indirectly Rand in that sense.
And then let's put a little context on that for folks who are listening. The Rand Corporation is one of the first organizations
The first.
to really think deeply about the future and not
Right.
just think about it, but put together a defensible methodology, a rigorous
Right.
methodology for thinking about the future. And they pioneered a number of techniques that everybody uses today that are kind of standard futurist protocol today. And my understanding is that your co-founder, Ted Gordon, was responsible for developing these techniques, these sort of scenario planning techniques, impact analysis, trend analysis, and so forth.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit more about Ted and
Yeah.
his contributions to futurology.
Yeah. Okay. Ted Gordon was working for McDonnell Douglas. Douglas at that point,
Mm-hmm.
Douglas Aircraft, and they got the contract from the Air Force to basically to create the Rand Corporation. So Ted was the consultant into that system.
Oh, wow. Oh, so before there was a Rand Corporation, he was already working on the project.
Well, no, he was working. He was in aerospace. He's a rocket scientist. He gave you the third stage of the Apollo rocket, by the way.
Okay.
So when somebody says it doesn't take rocket science, I say yes, it does, and there he is. But so he's just a super bright guy, and that's how. Well, Rand was a bunch of genius. That's what they wanted. They wanted the brightest guys to figure out how to avoid World War III. That was the job. All the rest of the stuff was entertainment and cocktails. And his contribution was, instead of just having a bunch of bright guys sitting around, and they were mostly guys sitting around a table figuring things out, he said, you got to have some methods here.
Yeah.
What about this quantitative? Come on, let's get serious here. So he created, and with another guy named Dalkey, the Delphi forecasting stuff, the repeating questionnaire system that brings together a lot of diverse ideas from different people that may not sit in the same room at the same time and had to deal with each other's ideas. Cross impact analysis. How does one thing affect another one? So it was a way he provided some methodological structure to what these geniuses were doing. The other guy, Herman Kahn, came up with the scenarios, and that was the idea of doing stories. So as you write a story, you find out what you don't know, because any writer can tell you at some point, they go, I don't know what happens next. That's important to know what you didn't know that you didn't even know you didn't know, but you had to know.
Herman Kahn gets a lot of the credit at Rand. I don't think Ted got enough of
Ted. Yeah, well, Ted was not as dramatic as Herman. He also wasn't as physically big as Herman.
Yeah.
I knew both.
Herman's known as Dr. Strangelove. Is that true?
Oh, he hated that. I knew both. I knew. Yeah. See, Strangelove. Remember, Strangelove went with the Heil Hitler stuff. Herman's Jewish. He's not going to do Heil Hitler.
Terrible. Oh, what a terrible. I didn't realize that. Oh, that's my.
So every time Pittman brings it up, he's like, oh, no.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But he gets a lot of credit for scenario planning. And of course, that's widely adopted and used. Yeah.
He created it. And the way scenario planning is done by futurists today is not the way Herman said.
Oh, tell me about that.
The purpose of scenario was not to say two uncertainties and here's the future, 4 different cells. The purpose was, as I said, you write a story and you expose your ignorance. And when you do the scenario planning the way people do it today, they don't get the cause and effect links between the present and the future. They're saying, here is the future. How does your strategy work in that future? Well, yeah, that's cool, but how did you get? Maybe that's not a plausible future. You may be wasting your time.
I so agree with you. I've come across what I call phony futurists or entertainment futurists, and they'll posit a scenario, but they don't tell you how they arrived at the scenario, and they don't justify it. And I'm sitting there going,
not a scenario.
I can think of 5 other alternatives. Like, how is that? How's that meant to be?
You should correct them to say that's a view of that's a future condition. Perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But a scenario is a story. In the entertainment world, scenario is a story.
Yeah.
It's not an endpoint.
And it's not the only story. There's an infinite number of possible stories. Because we try to think of a range of probabilities. Some of them are very unlikely. Some of them are highly likely. It's important to understand how you arrive at even that conclusion. And you also have to understand what are the telltale signs that mean a particular set of probabilities is coming into fruition. We may be trending toward that. And that's where things like trend analysis can be useful. What is decision modeling and substitution analysis? What are those techniques?
Okay. When you, much of it is decision matrix. You have like a bunch of criteria for the decision across the top of the matrix. And then down the left are your various policy options. And then you can say, okay, this has a 20% chance of occurring, and so you fill that sort of thing in. So you're trying to find out what are the optimum decisions for your criteria for making the decision in the first place. Because sometimes decision makers make it quick, but they forgot about this criteria and that. This externalizes it into a matrix.
That's really smart, because that prevents, there's a lot of CEOs in particular, but leaders in general, they get rewarded for making quick decisions, right? That our society tends to, favor people who seem to be decisive. That's like a leadership characteristic. Of course, it's a bias, and what they're playing with is cognitive bias. They're kind of confirming what we expect to see, and much of the hunt, those rapid decisions aren't really well formulated decisions. So it's really good to do that, to do the modeling of the decision matrix, because then you can say, hang on, you missed a couple points here. And it's a way to kind of balance, course correct.
It's good to do it with a small group of executives, because as you do that, someone will say, yeah, but you forgot X, like what you're just saying there. And that it forces a rich conversation.
Yeah. It can be frustrating for people who are decisive, because they don't like to be restrained in that way. Like they want to just be free to just kind of make their call and move on. I find it very interesting in business how people are, they get frustrated with analysis. They even criticize it. They'll call it analysis paralysis.
Right.
But the fact is, you're way better off measuring twice or maybe 10 times before you make a cut.
Well, some can be fun. Like, for example, let's say in this decision, there's 5 things that are going to affect it. So you do another little matrix, list the 5 down the column there and the 5 across the top. And you say, how can this thing affect that thing? Immediately, somebody's going to open up and says, well, goddamn, that's going to change the whole damn system. So that is so simple. I mean, it's a simple thing. It's not, in other words, people don't object to that because everybody's got their 2 cents on how this affects that. But by having a matrix, it's organized.
Yeah. So these methodologies were developed in the Rand Corporation. Ted Gordon played a role. As we mentioned, Herman Kahn also played a role. So there were a bunch of methodologies, but the Rand Corporation is a private corporation, and often the U.S. Defense Department, for instance, will turn to them for valuable insight. But the Millennium Project is a little bit different. It's outside of that system, and it actually was spawned in the UN. You mentioned the UN University in Tokyo. Tell me a little bit about the origins of this particular project.
Okay, I was the liaison. I was the liaison from UN University headquarters to the United States, and at the same time, believe it or not, the United States guy to Tokyo. So I had the hat on like this. It was very interesting. Exactly. Which probably meant it's the only reason why we're probably able to do this. Anyway, so I was asked by Ted Gordon, his group, say, hey, can you make something happen for the year 2000? And so we talked about it. Cold War was still going on in 1988.
Yeah.
How do you do a global think tank in the Cold War? All sides. It's a tricky business. So anyway, we were under the UN University officially for about the 3-year feasibility study. 3-year feasibility study. In a complex old deal. Anyway, and then when we began, we kept the UN relationship, but under the American Council. So it gave us we didn't have to be official, but it gave us all the access we needed. And then eventually we became independent in 20.
Well, probably what changed also is the Cold War ended, and so international cooperation became a little bit easier. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it was. It wasn't an us versus them.
Russia was one of the first donors.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So you have 70 nodes around the world. I know you've been building this up over time. Are there certain places that are more engaged and enthusiastic than others, or is everybody like super committed to this?
Yeah. I would say Europe as a whole is the most active. But that can be misleading because a lot of the Asians don't necessarily talk outside. Everybody's heard about the Japanese Keidan run and their 100-year plan. Anybody seen it?
Yeah, it's true. It's a cultural thing. I noticed that when I lived in Asia, when I worked in Asia, it's not that people aren't thinking about the future. They're just not in the habit of giving away information for free, particularly if it could be used against them, right? It's not pretty smart. Where Europe, if you think about, all the different languages and the close proximity of those countries, the Europeans have been leaders in standardization for centuries, right? The whole industrial era required them to find ways to interoperate and communicate and cooperate. Although, I can remember when I was young as a student that when you went from France to Spain, they had to pull the trains over to the side of the railroad. and changed the wheels because Franco had a different gauge in Spain. So, that standardization, though it sounds like it's like, been around for a couple hundred years, it's actually pretty recent. It's in living memory, I guess, is what I'm saying. But it is true the Europeans tend to work, they tend to be enthusiastic about standards projects. The United States always seems to march to a different drummer. And lately it seems like China does as well. They are pursuing their own interests as great powers. Have you found it easy to get cooperation in the US and China, or are there different
Yes.
considerations?
Yeah. Our work, the State of the Future specifically, has all of it has been published in China. For the first bunch of years, it was their Ministry of the public it was finance and economic publishing house and so forth. Then Ministry of Science and Technology. So we have been well received. We have been well received in China, and I've been talked there a number of times. And one of the things that we're trying to do at the moment is get some serious cooperation on how to structure the evolution of artificial general intelligence, because it's got to be U.S. and China, and there are secret meetings going on with that right now, and hopefully that'll evolve. But the short answer to your question, we have a lot of relations with China.
Great.
And so they see us as an honest broker.
That's cool. And in the U.S., what kind of people participate in the U.S.? Is there just one node in the U.S., or maybe there's more than one?
Yeah, there's one in the United States. Yeah, and it's in Silicon Valley. Okay. And the reason is because it's the only part of the United States that the rest of the world is accepting. If we put it in Washington, forget it. You put it in New York, maybe. But okay. Silicon Valley, you're sitting there in Iran, Silicon Valley, okay, I'll pay attention.
Oh, they want to hear that. Oh, because otherwise it feels like the official line coming from Washington.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting. And actually, that's why Silicon Valley, candidly, they're as far away from Washington as they can be and still be in the continental U.S. That's the whole point, right? They don't want to be under that influence.
Yeah.
And also, in a way, look at Silicon Valley is largely responsible for shaping at least the technological future, right? They do set the pace. So other people who are focused on technology, at least, they pay close attention. Although that's changing now too, because there are many other technology centers around the world. That's changed quite a lot in the last 20 years.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, tomorrow I go to Monterrey, which is sort of the Silicon Valley of Mexico.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so for the folks who are listening, we're going to get into the Millennium Report's State of the Future 20 report after the break. I'm interviewing Jerome Glenn. He's the CEO and the executive director of the Millennium Project. And as you've heard so far, this project is born of 50 years experience in future forecasting and analysis methodologies. It's a global effort with participation in 70 different countries around the world, a range of people who are in government and defense, as well as technology, private industry, and academia. So huge amounts of research and effort are put into this report, and the result itself is an everlasting gobstopper of a book of 500 pages. And this is a book that's available for folks who want to read it. If you want the distilled wisdom of 70 different nations' thoughts about the future, where can people find the Millennium Report, the State of the Future 20 report?
Well, if they go to Millennium, that's spelled the English way with two N's, millennium-project.org, they'll see it right up in front.
Great. The Millennium Project. So if you search that, you'll find it. We'll post that in the show notes as well. We're going to take a short break here, and then I'll be back with Jerome Glenn, and we'll talk about the contents of that report after this break.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurists podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tursik. This week, my co-host Brett King is traveling, but it's a bummer for him because we have such an excellent guest, someone I've wanted to talk to for such a long time. Jerome Glenn, the CEO and the leader of the Millennium Project. They've just published this massive 500-page report called The State of the Future 20. So, Jerome, tell us about this report. You got this massive report done. It's amazing, but it's a big undertaking for someone to read. And I'll be candid with you. I got through the executive summary, which is great, but I'm just dipping a toe into the ocean of the rest of that tome. Who are the people that read this book, and who did you have in mind when you wrote it?
Well, first, I'd like to say to your listeners, they can keyword search it to PDF. They don't have to worry about thumbing through 500 pages of paper. They can keyword search what they want.
Yeah, don't print this thing out, folks. It'll choke your print.
Right. The people who read this is a mix of basically senior decision makers or advisors, decision makers, or opinion leaders, the people who are serious about what's coming up. And
policymakers read it. And their legislative staff.
Their government, their legislative staff. We're doing a whole thing on AI with the legislative staff at the moment. Another story. Mm-hmm. But universities teach it. Universities, one of the large buyers of university libraries. Professors want to have their students read parts of this stuff. But it's basically government and business leaders.
It's an incredibly useful view for the reason we mentioned earlier. Your methodology means that it's going to be kind of refracted through the perspectives of literally hundreds of professionals in 70 nations around the world. So if you're looking for a distillation of what humanity thinks the future holds, this is about as close as you're going to get.
Yeah.
So what does humanity see? I see that artificial general intelligence is a mighty big topic in this particular edition. Yeah. Now, that's interesting. We've had a number of guests on the show talk about that. And as you know, the field's hotly contested. Right now, there is no artificial general intelligence. We have narrow artificial intelligence that's getting better by the day. But that's a far cry from general intelligence. Tell me about that distinction and your perception. And why did you include that as such a prominent part of the book?
Because it's not being dealt with well. That's why. One of our modus operandis is we do our global analysis and say, whoa, there's a big gap right there, and no one's doing a good job on it. So then we drill down into that thing. So that's what. And the
issue there is the governance in particular. Right? That we have no methodology for governing a general intelligence. Right. We talk about it, people speculate about it.
We don't have it for narrow either. We have nothing for narrow, really.
Well, that's true. You're right. No, in fact, it's
Europe's got some stuff, and China does. That they have some rules, but they're narrow oriented. It's not general oriented.
That's right. And even those rules, each of those places, China and Europe, they're keenly conscious that the more they impose regulation on narrow artificial intelligence, the more likely it is they're going to lose jobs and momentum to countries that don't regulate at all, like the United States, where it's a free fire zone. Right now we have an arms race in AI in the United States. There's a handful of very large companies that are willing to spend billions of dollars. Look at OpenAI, just closed a funding round that values the company at hundreds of billions of dollars. They are seeking to raise enough money to build a general intelligence. They think they're going to get there by scaling. We hear now Microsoft wants to build $100 billion data center to support this. That's going to be critical infrastructure. It's also going to be a critical target if there's ever kind of a military action to preempt one country or another. And it might actually lead to that, right? Because in some respects, the country that gets there first, the nation that gets there first is going to have a tremendous advantage over other nations. Tell me a little bit about that scary scenario.
Well, there are obviously a lot of efforts to try to figure out how to avoid that scenario. Going all the way from creating artificial general intelligence as a decentralized global system with nobody completely in charge, all the way to different heuristics and algorithms that doesn't require massive amounts of data. So there's different approaches going on. And China's in a rush, United States, there's a whole bunch of people, obviously, as you know, in a rush. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised if it doesn't happen like popcorn. Pop it up all over the place. And that's why we want to do some regulations ahead of time, because that can be a nightmare, that all interactions and so forth. but to your first point about the idea of AGI taking over, what happens if somebody, let's say country X or corporation X creates it, and organized crime group 2 figures out how to get in?
Yeah.
And then it sort of takes it over, because when people boo-poo this, I go like, have you noticed how much money organized crime makes per year? It's more than all the military budgets combined.
Yeah.
And they don't have to answer to Congress.
No, and they're doing it digitally. Like the crime happens digitally now because there's no
Right.
fingerprints. Like you can
So
heist
they got some very sharp people in organized crime who I am sure are crawling all over the AGI stuff at this moment.
And
So,
Leopold Aschenbrenner is a scientist who worked at OpenAI as a researcher on general AI security. And he left there recently and publishes another massive tome on the web. But his concern is the low level of security at the big AI research labs. He's like, it's easy to hack these places. It would be trivial for a national government to hack in. He said it's almost a given that they have been hacked and don't even know it yet. So these companies think that they're at the very leading edge, but what they may be doing is basically leaking the information to adversarial countries or maybe even non-state actors. Like you said, criminals could be getting their hands on this information. So where we think we have control, we think we have accountability from companies that we know, there may be other organizations that we're fully unaware of. Is Interpol and are international police focused on this as an issue at all?
They're having meetings and conferences. How good they are, I don't know, but they do have, yes, they do have them. But on your point there, one of the things we have in the State of the Future report section it was on national licensing, and what are the various criteria to get just like a driver's license. There's certain things you got to license. Right, same thing for this. So in one of those elements to get a license is you got to prove the security of your systems. So your point is very well taken. We're saying that you're not allowed to do business in AGI unless you can prove to me your system is protected and how you're protecting it.
But I know from other folks we've spoken to on this topic that there are at least 2 reasons why that's going to be very hard to manage. One is open source. As you know, the open source models and their weights have been leaked. And so there's now thousands of scientists around the world who are working on that. And the second thing is rogue states that are not accountable to other states. They very well might create a supercomputing cluster there that we wouldn't be able to know about or track.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons I was up with these UN meetings. There's a thing called the former presidents of the General Assembly of the UN. It's like 20 of these folks, and they're like the council for the General Assembly. And they had me, the only outside guy, come in and say, "You got to deal with this issue, whether you like it or not," because the fact is, if it's just what you point out. If country A does everything right and country B doesn't, we're still in a mess.
Yeah.
So we have no choice but to create some international mechanism. Now, it can be a multi-stakeholder mixed thing, not just countries, but and we also want it to be a hybrid, part AI and part human interplay. The organization would be quite unique to do it. And they took it quite well. And I will go to their annual meeting next month and go further into this so that we all know it's going to take a hell of a lot of work and a lot of time to get a serious global system in place before AGI arrives.
Right. Because all the parties involved are working hellbent to try to get first, to try to be there first, that whether it's a nation or a private company or some criminal organization, presumably. Okay.
Now here, if I can answer one more comment on that.
Sure.
This is your listeners are going to say I'm way too idealistic, but I am of the opinion that China and others that people think might not cooperate, China is very vulnerable because they're largely integrated AI system, more than the United States. So they're very vulnerable as a result. Secondly, organized crime the guys that actually know what they're doing in organized crime with their fingers on the keys. They know as well as anybody else, this can come back and bite them too.
Oh, wow.
So people may have to say, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to collaborate, because if we don't, we can get screwed too.
Wow.
Just like the nuclear, because it's not that the United States and Soviet Union really wanted to make an arms race, but they had to. They were forced because they couldn't have out of control arms race. They knew it was suicide.
Right. Well, that brings me to the next topic that is in your report, which is the nuclear arms race is back. Right, the Cold War is over, but now we seem to have nuclear proliferation is underway.
Yeah.
Some people say that the risk of a nuclear war is greater than ever, not just because of the Ukraine conflict, of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, which is certainly one factor there. And one of the reasons the United States and the Western countries and NATO haven't responded more forcefully
Yeah.
to that invasion is that they're afraid of escalating into a nuclear war. Well, other nations around the world paid attention, and some of those nations like to misbehave and test boundaries. And they're noticing that, oh, if you've got nuclear weapons, you can get the West to back down. And so that mindset that started perhaps in that Ukraine conflict is now proliferated across the country. And some nations, led by bad actors, are going to test the boundaries of nuclear non-proliferation. So does your report anticipate further proliferation of nuclear weapons? And do you see us being on the brink of a new Cold War or a new nuclear war?
We don't do prediction as such.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like saying, here's a variety of things you got to consider. Now, we didn't focus a lot on the nuclear confrontation because, in my view, as I mentioned before, we try to go into areas that other people are not doing well.
Yeah.
I mean, Rand and a bunch of other players are full tilt into this. And I didn't see us making any more improvement on it other than explain, look, you got to deal with this. And so we don't. And also, we mentioned before about Herman Kahn. I actually knew Herman Kahn well and worked off and on with him during the Cold War. And almost anything serious you don't want to say. It's a weird comment because a lot of this is like, it's almost like witchcraft. I accused Herman, by the way, one time of being a witch doctor. His wife is furious. Herman later on pulls me over and says, you got it right. Because you're doing, it's a perceptual thing.
Yeah.
All right. I'll let you in on a little secret people didn't know about. And if you did, I'll be surprised. The fallout shelter program had nothing to do with what people said it had to do with. It had to do with convincing, because, do a 30-year scenario. What happens if there's no nuclear war? You end up with people in the Kremlin who you didn't know. Geopolitical situation is different. The weapon system, there's so much different going on. How can you put together a strategy that would anticipate the unknown? Like, how do you convince the unknown you're crazy enough to press the button? Hard. The answer was fallout shelters. The idea is if Cuba didn't work out right, and a lot of people start going to fallout shelters all over the country. So if you're sitting there in Moscow watching your CNN, and all of a sudden you see these massive traffic jams in Miami, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, what do you think? Oh, goddamn Yankees are crazy. They're actually going to go to war. That was the purpose of the fallout shelter program. It was deterrence, not survival.
Oh, my goodness.
But you couldn't say it during the Cold War.
No, of course not. And I did not know that. So that's
No one did.
gamesmanship on a global
Matter of
level.
fact, I'm getting goose flesh right now as I describe it.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's wow. That's like theater. That's like nuclear war theater or deterrence theater.
And we called it the con job, Herman Kahn.
Now, there's a third major factor of concern. We talked about artificial general intelligence. We talked a bit about the possibility of a new nuclear arms race. But there's a third issue that looms large, which is climate change and temperature increase. You also cover that in this report as well. So tell me a little bit about your findings there. That's another topic that's well covered in other formats.
Good. I'm glad you set it up that way because it's well covered, but there is one big gap.
Good.
And the gap we found was food, because if you do, one of the things you do in policy analysis is cost effect, but also you should do time to impact. So changing the global energy system to non-fossil, time to impact, like take a look at the data. You're looking way down the road, even though you got all kinds of new stuff happening, but that's because we want more energy, right? So the new stuff is fine, but the old stuff is still the majority of what's going on down the road, way down. Same thing with transportation. You got an awful lot of these cars still on the road. They go for 17 years on an average.
That's right.
So
it's
again,
nice that people are buying electric vehicles, but we're going to have gas powered cars for a very long time,
Right. So then the part that you can have faster impact is what people eat. There's an FAO study done 2009 or something like that. And it showed that the entire livestock industry, not simply cow farts, but the entire livestock industry, everything, transportation, shipping, going to Korea with meat, and so all together is about the same as the impact of transportation on greenhouse gases as a whole. So if we can make meat from genetic material, not the vegetable stuff, but the genetic material directly, which has been sold in Singapore now for 2 years, and Food and Drug Administration in the United States has approved it. But the reason you don't see it because we haven't gotten the scaling up problem solved yet. We know how to do it. You can make a hamburger right now, but you got to scale up.
It's a $250 hamburger, but
right. So you got to bring it down, right, and therefore scale it up. But if we can do this, we'll have much greater impact by changing the food system per time. Again, the factor is time. We can have more impact in less time because people still want to eat meat. What got me on this was I saw this in India, the data that as people got richer, they ate more meat. I said, well,
100%. Same thing in China and other parts of Asia. As people grow prosperity, they want more meat.
Right. So if you can't keep the Indians off of meat growing, then what are you going to do? You can't convince Germany for sure. So you're going to have to say, so what? And the vegetable stuff was a nice bridging, but that's not quite as great. But the animal, you can go directly, because then you can get return on investment immediately once you're gearing up and ready to go. Whereas
what you're referring to is things like methane release from livestock, which is a factor in climate change. That's an emission. And also the costs of the food that the animals are, the feed for the livestock.
Right.
There's also climate impact there as well.
But a majority of the stuff we grow is not for us. The majority is actually to feed animals that we eat. The majority. Okay, also, same thing with pharmaceuticals. The majority of the pharmaceuticals go to animals that we eat, not to us.
So your report found something new, something novel in the area of climate change.
Well, novel in the sense of policy. If you put more attention into the food part, you're going to have a faster impact. I mean, not knocking the other stuff, keep doing that. But here's a gap in the game.
Now, a lot of people feel like the progress on transportation, for instance, mitigating the climate emissions, the gas emissions from that, has been moving slowly. And even though there is progress, they despair, right? And what you're pointing out is there's a whole other field with equal amounts of gains available to us if we focus on that in addition, not as a substitute.
Right.
You also talk about COVID-19, and I wanted to ask you a specific question about infectious disease and public health. I mean, what my feeling about COVID-19 is that it was a test of the public health system, and we comprehensively failed. Humanity failed the test completely. We tried a lot of different things. Some of us didn't try very hard, but we tried many things, and humanity failed the test several times. Like many people got COVID a couple of times in a row. And now the big fear is some sort of engineered virus or some sort of engineered infectious disease. So in other words, somebody with malicious intent can hijack perhaps like a virus that's very infectious, reprogram it, and thereby use that as a transport mechanism to infect maybe the whole population, or maybe they can target that by genome and focus on just one segment of the population. Scary scenario. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, we call it CMAD, single individual massively destructive. When you talk to the military, you got to have an abbreviation.
So the military already has an acronym for it. There, problem solved.
Yeah. Right. And then we have a triad, another triad defense. The technical means, which is most of it. And then you got public education and public health to reduce the number of wackos. And then, how the family and community works with people growing up. So you have a little triad, to take care of CMAD. I shouldn't be laughing at this, but because it's probably one of the nastiest problems we face, because eventually we did a workshop for NATO on this stuff. And we said it concluded in there that was as an estimate, 10 years, the possibility of an individual acting alone, which is the key word here, acting alone, can make and deploy through synthetic biology, starting from scratch, such a weapon. And I don't want to go into details about how you deploy it and all that sort of stuff, but it's a possibility. And nobody really wants to talk too much about it in public because you want to figure out how to prevent this stuff before it ever starts. But yeah, that's a real that's one of the things on the list of things to worry about.
Wow. All right. Well, we just covered 4 really significant, broad potential challenges. But I think it's important in the remaining time that we have, we should talk about the prospects of a positive future. And one of the points that your report makes is, in spite of these major threats, the reality is that most people on the planet Earth today are experiencing prosperity, and most people are experiencing peace. You wouldn't get that by looking at the newspaper. You wouldn't get that if you read the front page of the paper, because
Right.
what the news reports on is conflicts. That's what's exciting and interesting and sells. And so it seems like, wow, there's a lot of wars, a lot of conflict. The reality is that these conflicts, even the big one, like in the Ukraine, they're geographically constrained. They're not using weapons of mass destruction in the classical sense of that. They are using big weapons to level cities. That's no joke. I don't want to underscore. I don't want to minimize that at all. But they're not using weapons of mass destruction. Nobody's so far using a nuclear weapon, for instance. The fights are super intensive in the regions they're happening, but they're contained to relatively small areas. And my point is simply this: it doesn't mean that there isn't conflict. Of course there is, and it's tragic whenever it happens and wherever it happens. But most people aren't experiencing that. This is the first time in a long time. If you think of, say, in World War II, during the period from the late 1930s through 1945, 1,000 people were dying every minute during that period of time. That was death on a massive scale, and very few parts of the world escaped unscathed from that. Unscathed meaning their cities were intact and people weren't slaughtered on a massive level. That's less than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So this has to be considered a kind of progress, looking back at that, to say, okay, we haven't done away with war as an instrument of national policy. It still exists. It probably will in the future. What we have been able to do, though, is narrow its impact. It's still a deep impact. It's still tragic when it happens. It's destructive on a mind-bending scale. But we're not taking out entire cities. We're not destroying entire or displacing entire populations. Talk a little bit about that from the perspective of your report, because I noticed that in there. I was like, oh, this is a good topic. I mean, I'm not even framing it in the most positive way in your report. It's much more positive than what I just sketched out.
Yeah, what we did, we've created since the year 2000, do it about every year or two. It's called a State of the Future Index.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 10-year index. Like, are we getting better or worse in 10 years? And the answer is, well, it depends. Well, of course, depends on what. So we go through a torturous process, coming out with 29 variables. And it's starting off by saying, if the future is better in 10 years, what does it mean specifically? So around the world, they give the answers. So we ended up with many variables, but a lot of them didn't have good data. So we ended up with at least 29 variables that had good, reliable data for the past 20 years, which gave us the ability to look out, project to 10 years. And then we send out a questionnaire around the world and say, okay, how can variable 1, what's the best possible for it? Plausible possible. What's the worst possible? So this gives us a range between good and bad. Very simple.
Mm-hmm.
And then we put all the good and bads together. So that's how we get an integrated index. So of the 29 variables, I don't have an exact number of how many are really good, but the majority are getting better.
Yeah.
And when I update the State of the Future, I go all these details on the 15 global challenge. I'm going to sit there with a cross out 2.0, add in 2.4. Most of the stuff is going in the right direction. Where it's not going in the right direction is deadly seriously. Obviously, things like weapons, things like climate change, global warming, organized crime, unemployment situation, and so forth. There's a lot, there's just bad stuff out there. But we are winning more than we're losing.
And that shows up in terms of household wealth, the number of people, or the percentage of humanity that is moving out of dire poverty into something that we call middle class.
That's a great indicator. How long you're living on.
That's right. So in terms of like life outcomes, all those indexes are actually positive, but that story doesn't get enough news. This is kind of like Matt Ridley's Rational Optimist, where if you can detach from your personal situation in your own nation or your own neighborhood, and you can kind of zoom out to the global level, hundreds of millions of people have been moved out of poverty over the last 20 years, and they're experiencing a kind of prosperity.
The number on this is really dramatic. If you go back to 1980, more than half the world was in extreme poverty.
Wow.
Right? Now we've added a few more billion people to the planet, and it's less than 10%
That's
is in
astounding.
extreme poverty. So like the amount of people pouring out of extreme poverty is gigantic. Mostly India and China, I admit. There's some areas where there hasn't been much progress in a lot of places. But overall, if you look at the aggregate, the whole world is healthier, better educated, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we're doing it at the cost of we're withdrawing a lot of money from the bank account that's known as the natural environment, right? We're drawing down fossil fuel, or drawing down on the green, the forests, our green capital, I guess is what I'd say. So the way we're getting people into prosperity or moving them out of dire poverty is we're spending scarce resources to get there. And that's part of what's also reflected in your report. Well, in the last few minutes that we have left, what would you give as a message to our listeners about the future, about the next 10 years? So what would you say your general takeaway is on this massive report that you just published? What should we know about that perspective? Is it something we should be scared about? Is it something we should be enthusiastic about? Is there some mix?
Yeah. Well, this goes back a little bit to what I just said before. Is we're winning more than we're losing, but where we're losing is very serious. So to me, the attitude is we have no right to be pessimistic because we're winning more than we're losing. But we have no right to relax.
Right. You can't be complacent. That's right.
So be serious. And on top of it, get off this idea of saying, well, is water more important than energy? You want to do water? You do water. You want to do energy? You do. We got to do all this stuff. Stop arguing with each other. Just you do your own. We got plenty of work to do.
And in some respects, solving these problems or addressing them or mitigating these risks, they also present great opportunities. Like this is the job of humanity, to solve these problems. The people who step up
make money. Right.
That's right.
Make money in business.
And if for someone who desires to have a great impact on their life, these are the fields that require those kinds of people. That's a beacon for those who are interested in really truly solving problems. Yeah. Well, gosh, Jerome, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience before we wrap up?
I guess the last thing I'd say is if you don't have a whole lot of time, I wish you'd get the report, but if you can't, you don't have a lot of time. Go to our website and click on 15 Global Challenges and pick out the challenge of your choice, because each challenge gets a very detailed, about 1 page or so, where we think this is the best 1 or 2 pages you can get on this topic. And if not, let me know what's better. And then here's a list of actions to deal with it. And then here are the regional considerations. So what for Africa? So what for Asia? So, so each challenge of the 15 is all by itself a good thing to read through.
Oh, that's great. Well, maybe we'd like to have you come back in the future where you can get a chance to talk to Brett, because he's bummed that he couldn't join us today. And we'll have you come back and talk about those 15 global challenges. In the meantime, folks who are listening, this has been an interview with Jerome Glenn, and he leads the Millennium Project. If you found this interesting, I would encourage you to check out the website. It is millenniumproject.org. There's a hyphen in the middle, so it's actually millennium-project.org. And there you can find links to the State of the Future report and some of the information that Jerome just shared about the 15 global challenges. I hope you will take time to do it. Jerome, this has been a pure pleasure for me. Methodology is something I care deeply about. I've been reading about Herman Kahn. Of course, I never met him, but making acquaintance with you is great because I feel like a direct connection there to the Rand Corporation and your former colleague, Ted Gordon, to whom we owe so much for developing the methodologies that Futurists use today. Thank you for joining us on the Futurists.
My pleasure.
Great to have you with us. And for those who are listening, I just want to give a shout out to Kevin Hirscharn, who is our engineer, Elizabeth Severance, our producer, and the whole team at Provoke Media that make this show possible. And we'd love to hear from our fans and followers on social media about the topics we're covering or the topics you think we should be covering and the guests that you'd like to hear from. So please keep those suggestions rolling in. Every week, Brett and I will bring you another person who's thinking about and influencing and shaping the future. And until then, I will see you in the future. Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast. for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.